This is MetroFocus with Raphael P. Roman, Jack Ford, and Jenna Flanagan. MetroFocus is made possible by Sue and Edgar Wackenheim III, Sylvia A. and Simon B. Poita Programming Endowment to Fight Anti-Semitism, the Peter G. Peterson and Joan Gans Cooney Fund, Bernard and Denise Schwartz, Barbara Hope Zuckerberg, the Ambrose Monell Foundation, and by Janet Prindle Seidler, Jody and John Arnhold, Cheryl and Philip Milstein family, Judy and Josh Weston, Dr. Robert C. and Tina Sohn Foundation, the JPB Foundation.
Good evening and welcome to the MetroFocus Front Page Forecast. I'm Jenna Flanagan. We begin our weekly look ahead at the major headlines and their potential impact on the tri-state with the courtroom sentencing so many were watching closely. Just last Friday, a Minnesota judge gave Derek Chauvin 22 and a half years for murdering George Floyd. The question now, will this sentence and case lead to lasting and systemic change? We'll try to make sense of what happened in court and where New York and the nation can go from here. And speaking of the city, there was yet another shooting in Times Square yesterday. The latest gun violence coming as New Yorkers wait to hear who might be their next mayor and what that could mean for public safety. With absentee ballots still trickling in, we're a day away from the Board of Elections releasing an unofficial report on the preliminary ranked choice results. So let's get the conversation started. Back with us tonight with their take on the headlines and what else could drive news this week are J.C. Polanco, political commentator, CUNY BMCC faculty member, and former president of the New York City Board of Elections. J.C., always great to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with all of you.
We're also joined tonight by Kirk Burkhalter, a professor of law at New York Law School, director of the 21st Century Policing Project, and retired NYPD detective. Welcome, Kirk.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
And we're also joined tonight by Nayela Amaru, a Democratic political strategist. Nayela, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So first, let's start off with, of course, that big sentencing that came down last Friday. And that, of course, was of Derek Chauvin. And more than anything, I want to get everyone's reaction to how they thought that was handled. Now, of course, the judge could have given more time. Perhaps less time could have been given. There's also a question of how much time served and et cetera. So what do we think of the 22 years? And Kirk, seeing as how you are a retired member of the NYPD, I want to start with you and get your perspective on how the sentencing was handled.
Sure. So the judge somewhat split the difference. The maximum that Chauvin could have faced was 40 years, and the minimum was 12 and a half. The prosecution asked for 30, and believe it or not, his defense attorney asked for probation. So that was never going to happen. So, there's an old adage, when no one is happy, the judge probably got it right. And I think that's probably what occurred in this case. There are some that think that he should have received the max, and there are others that think that the sentence, a minority of folks think the sentence should have been lower. So I do think the sentence is appropriate. I also think it would have been appropriate for him to receive more time. What's important to remember is that police officers traditionally are never really sentenced for murder. So this case is very much an outlier in two respects: the end result, and of course, the heinousness of the crime, which precipitated the end result here.
Of course, JC.
Well, I agree with the professor. There's no question. I think this was one of those sentences that, in my opinion, it could have gotten a lot worse. When the judge was speaking, I was bracing myself because I thought it was going to be a lot lower than it was. It was almost a relief. But, the impact of the sentence and of the case and of the entire George Floyd murder is going to be one that's going to last for a long time. George Floyd's daughter said that her dad changed the world. We are having the conversation about police abuse more than ever before in a lot of places that wouldn't have that conversation before. I think a lot of independent-minded voters, a lot of centrists like myself, are now discussing whether or not there's something here. And I think a lot of us are late to the conversation, but George Floyd changed the world, and that we are speaking about reforms that are so necessary in police departments around the country and really around the world as we start looking at police interaction with the community. So I think it's going to be long lasting, to answer your question, Jenna.
Okay. And Nyala, your reaction?
Yeah, so I think it's important that we acknowledge the difference between holding an individual officer accountable and holding the system accountable that creates such an officer in the first place. And so I think to the point that was already raised, this is unusual in the sense that there is an individual police officer that is in fact being held accountable and is, got a more harsh sentence than I think originally anticipated. With that said, I think it's also important to acknowledge, the unique nature of the Chauvin case that makes it difficult to say whether or not it's going to set any real precedent in terms of the criminal justice system overall. Because I think that the deeper question is, can we actually reproduce this outcome that prevents the creation of Derek Chauvin's who are wearing the badge or are currently going through police training or even considering a career in law enforcement. And so while I think that the sentencing is significant in the sense that it is the first time that a police officer is being held accountable and is facing a harsher punishment, I think that the deeper question still remains to be seen in terms of its impact on the overall system.
Of course. And now, Kirk, that seems to be the secondary issue to all of this. A lot of people have voiced concerns that, as Nyala pointed out, that this shouldn't be a one-off case. It's the system that allowed a cop like him to have as many complaints against him about escalatingly dangerous behavior to continue to be on the force. So from your perspective, there's a push-pull against, do we continue to try to reform police departments? Do we defund, refund, et cetera? What do you see as the next steps to keep us from being in this position again? And would it be several steps before we get to that place where we aren't so concerned about the behavior of police officers and are they abusing their power?
Oh, I think it'll be several steps. And I think you framed the question quite accurately here in that, what does this really mean and what will it look like moving forward? And how did Derek Chauvin get to this point to begin with? Because he was pretty much a guided missile. Let's not forget that he, a few years prior, he did the same action with a teenager in his home. He had his knee on his neck and choked him to death, basically. So quite often we find that when you have an officer like this in your department, someone knows. The way it usually manifests itself is other police officers will simply say, I don't want to work with that person. But rarely is the extra step taken where to find out why folks don't want to work with Kirk. Oh, well, we find out because Kirk likes to assault people. So that has to be addressed first, right? Who are we hiring? And what went on with, like I said, this is very much an outlier. What went on in this case has nothing to do with training. This has to do with a person who should not have been on the police department. That being said, moving forward with the way we train and educate our police officers is huge. Now, keep in mind, law enforcement is a local issue. And it's very rare that the federal government intercedes. And that's how we will move the needle forward, with the federal government in some way, shape, or form interceding in developing standards, baselines for all police departments. So that's going to take some time, it's going to take money, and it's going to take consistent action and pressure.
Well, if we just make this just local, and of course we are a local show, so we would be talking about the NYPD. JC, I'm wondering from your perspective, is this something that's even possible of the NYPD beginning to, for lack of a better description, perhaps purge some of the more problematic or complaint-heavy officers who are on the force? And wouldn't that be in direct opposition of everything that their union stands for?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that, thanks to Professor and so many other police of color, the police department looks a lot more like New York City than it did before. And that, I think, is a step in the right direction. As more of my students at BMCC decide to join the NYPD, we're starting to see more and more folks that come from our communities patrolling the streets. I don't want to make the Chauvin case and the George Floyd murder to be indicative of the hard work that the NYPD does every day. And I think that we may end up castigating a lot of good police officers in New York City because of the Chauvin decision. I do hope that as we diversify our police ranks, not only in racial and ethnic background, but in geographic diversity as to where they come from. We want them to come more from New York City. I think you're going to see a police department that is not going to it's not going to react in the same way, and it's going to focus more on de-escalating circumstances much more than before. I really do believe that, but I don't want to have the George Floyd case be a reason for which now people are going to start castigating those hardworking men and women that do dedicate themselves to law enforcement.
Well, to take this out of the local arena into the federal one, because Nayela, I'm sure as everyone on this panel is aware of, the George Floyd case was the spark or the inspiration for, of course, the George Floyd, policing reform bill that's being worked on right now. And so, Nayela, from your perspective, is there, I guess, what could possibly be the happy medium? I mean, we're still waiting to hear even the most basic things about this legislation that New Jersey Senator Cory Booker and, of course, Tim Scott from South Carolina, I believe, are supposed to be working on.
Absolutely. You know, I think it's interesting, the point that JC brought up in terms of at the local level, trying to diversify our police force. But I think it also, even diversifying the NYPD does not necessarily really touch into the culture change that's necessary, right? And so I think that it's a both and part in trying to move towards a solution. And I don't necessarily know if it's going to make everyone happy, but I think that what the Chauvin court case brought up, I think, into a more public narrative is focusing on the bad apple aspect of focusing on, instead of being anti-police, framing their argument as we are pro-police, but we just want to focus on the bad apples in the system. And I don't know if that's necessarily the most beneficial long-term strategy of trying to find solutions that necessarily make everyone happy, because if you're going to prosecute police officers by focusing on them as being the bad apples that are in the system, I think it does create an opportunity for the system to still continue to evade accountability, which is the overall larger system that we're trying to, I think, find relief to that tension of is this a bad apple argument, or is this going to be a larger conversation and trying to find policy solutions that change the structural that change the structure of the systems that create these things to happen and behavior to be allowed in the first place.
Well, you know, of course, with all larger conversations, we always have to deal with subtlety and nuance. And so while there is this conversation about how we move forward with policing in America in general, there's also the concern, deep concern and conversation about the rise in violence that we've been seeing, especially this summer, pseudo post-pandemic, although not official and certainly not really. But Kirk, I want to get your take because, as I said in the intro, there was another shooting in Times Square, and there has been some very disturbing sharp rise in violent crime, shooting deaths in New York City, some which have been caught on camera. And from your perspective, are those two things that at least we can hold and do at the same time? Can we talk about how we reform and better the NYPD while also dealing with a rise in crime that's quite disturbing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The two are not mutually exclusive. An effective police department is not a police department that does not combat crime. It's just the opposite. An effective police department is one that combats crime, delivers all types of other services, and that's a conversation for another day. I think the police department is spread far too thin, right? We're asking police officers to do everything in the world when they really shouldn't be. And but that's not exclusive, and they exist to protect the rights of all individuals, including those whom they arrest. So, you know, when we see this spike in crime, this is perhaps reflective of the fact that our police departments haven't grown in the same manner that society has grown. There are a lot of good police officers out there that certainly want to do their job, but are we effectively giving them the tools to do so? Are we deploying them correctly? Are we allocating our resources where they should be allocated? I'm a firm believer that we're going to need the police in society, right? It's kind of a non-starter to say, let's get rid of the police. However, what do the police look like? And there's been a large conversation about the fact that, well, we have this spike in crime because of all the bail reform. Well, that's actually not true, because in New York State, the likelihood of a person's propensity to commit some form of crime or danger to society has not been at issue. It wasn't at issue, hasn't been at issue since the 1970s or prior. So the reform doesn't focus on that aspect. It's not that these folks would not be out now because of bail reform, but because of bail reform, they're out in the street. That is not the issue. So first, let's get all the misinformation that's out there. Let's get it straight, and let's focus on more effective policing and the deployment of resources. Perhaps if police stop tracking down untaxed cigarettes and counterfeit bills and so forth and so on, they would have more time to combat these unlicensed firearms that proliferate our society. And by the way, it's not just New York, right? So when this happens in the urban city, everyone goes crazy. However, we've seen a spike in shootings all across the country, mass shootings. So it's not just New York. This is a problem in this country.
JC, I feel like before we say that it is misinformation, I feel like you would have a counter argument to the issue of whether or not bail reform has played a role in this increase in violence.
There's no question, in my opinion, that it has. I think that when you arrest a gangbanger with a gun at your school, and then you release that gangbanger out into the community in which that person lives, dwells, and terrorizes within a couple of hours, I think you make that community less safe. Take, for instance, the gangbanger that decided to shoot at the children in the Bronx just last week, right on Sheridan Avenue. This guy had been arrested for an armed robbery in the train the month before. Right before that, he was arrested for attempted murder and revenge porn. I mean, the fact that this guy was walking the streets because judges do not have the discretion anymore to decide whether or not someone is going to be held with bail, I think it's a major problem. We are creating an issue where we're putting our head in the sand. This is what's happening, Jenna. We have to admit that there has been racial discrimination in our criminal justice system, full stop, period, right? We have to understand that there have been people that look like me and you and others on this panel who were not allowed to have bail because of the color of their skin. That's a fact. And the fact is that if you've been poor, that's also a reason why you weren't allowed to get, let's deal with that. At the same time, politicians have to balance keeping our community safe. And telling me that you're going to release a gangbanger who has done what this guy did back into the community because you are now putting policies to take care of the issue of discrimination, right? And not keeping in mind the need of keeping us safe. It's turning a blind eye to crime. And what's happening with this lackadaisical no bail that we're seeing is that you're creating environments where people are terrorizing their communities and they're coming right back. And it doesn't stop there. Now, defendants are allowed to get personal information from every witness, right? That may be part of their prosecution, intimate information as to the person that they've accosted. So this criminal justice reform is really not what I think a lot of people, they're well-intentioned, but the consequences of these things are creating an environment where kids are getting shot in our streets. Gun violence is real, but there are bad people pulling those triggers, and we got to take care of that.
Kirk, very quickly, I just want to give you a chance to respond.
Sure, I absolutely agree. My only point is the change in the bail laws. So for instance, this person who committed the shooting, prior to this reform, they would have been released anyway. So that's my only point, is that the reform has not addressed violent criminals in this respect. So this person would have been released prior to the reform. If the system works, if the judges and so forth follow what they're supposed to do, this person is not a non-violent offender. So certainly, it's New York State has always been about whether the person is available or will a likelihood of showing up to court. Is there a need for the type of reform where we consider, like New Jersey, whether someone is a threat to society? Perhaps we should. My point is that has never been the case in New York.
All right,
so perhaps the reform should be.
We're going to have to put a pin in that because we do have to move on. But Niala, I want to make sure that I also bring you into this conversation and just sort of ask, from not just a legislative point, but I think something that a lot of activists also point out is that a lot of this crime is because of underlying issues in underserved and at-risk communities, et cetera. So from your perspective, this rise in gun violence, are we Are we treating the perhaps the mole and not the cancer, for lack of a better description?
Essentially, yes. I think that, one of the issues is that right now, because bail reform was relatively, new, and then we experienced a spike, it was the scapegoat, if you will. However, to the points that have already been raised, these issues, spikes in crime have been happening before bail reform was passed. And so I don't necessarily think that it is the reason that we are now experiencing a spike in crimes. But I also, think it's really important that we acknowledge that there is a nuance to this conversation that oftentimes is lost when we oversimplify issues such as, bail reform is the reason for, New York City falling apart post-COVID, and not really acknowledging the larger structural issues that again create, these types of behaviors and systems such as poverty, employment, all the things that interact with each other. And it's not as simple as pinpointing it to a specific legislation that was passed relatively recently.
Okay, well, listen, this is a conversation that is worth continuing. And of course, we at MetroFocus will be here to continue it. But I do want to move to the person who will most likely be dealing with this rise in violent crime and bail reform and various other issues between New York City and Albany, and that is whoever becomes the city's next mayor. We understand that soon, very soon, allegedly, I don't know, we're going to find out who's in the lead with the ranked choice voting. And so, JC, I'll start with you. I mean, we know that a lot of absentee ballots have come in. I believe that Catherine Garcia has indicated that she thinks she's going to get a good boost from a lot of those ballots, but it still seems as if Eric Adams is next in line.
Well, there is a November election, right? So he may have pulled off the Democratic nomination. And I think that, with a 75,000 vote lead with over 150,000 or so absentee ballots, it looks like it. But remember, this nonsensical, as you know how I feel about it already, Jenna, this ranked choice voting has created an environment where theoretically he still may lose. He still may lose. You have to remember it's true. There was some collusion at the very end between Garcia and Yang, where they decided just vote whichever one of us, as long as you don't vote for Eric, to try to hurt Eric's campaign. And now what you're dealing with, I think, is you're going to have more of those number 2 votes going to Maya Wiley and Catherine Garcia. So I really do believe that this is going to be a lot closer at the end than people think. And I can see Maya Wiley closing in the gap in the later weeks. There's no question about it. I think a lot of Catherine Garcia's votes and Yang votes will be going to Maya. So we'll see what happens. But I think that people are going to wake up to the nonsense of ranked choice voting and get rid of it. First opportunity.
Now, instead of, as from your point of view, Kirk, as a former NYPD detective, but as a professor of law, your thoughts on the way at least this first round of ranked choice voting has gone in New York City?
Well, the first thing I have to say is remember the good old days where the day after election you could buy the newspaper and the headline would show you who won? Boy,
and then we could all move on. Yeah.
Whatever happened to that? But this is really important because what's on the mind of local politics is so different from national politics. As a native New Yorker, what do New Yorkers what are they concerned about? They're concerned about the schools their children go to. They're concerned about the services that are delivered. Trash being picked up on time, snow being removed, being able to walk from the bus stop or the train to their home safely any time of night, and being able to afford, goods and services. So that's very different than the national level. And I think quite often when we see local politicians try to attack problems very, very broadly and cast a wide net, it doesn't get done because it's just difficult to do that in New York City. It's much easier to move the needle with these issues that folks are invested in. From a legal standpoint, just getting things done, politicians who tend to have some experience in local government or state government or national government seem to do well. That's not to say a freshman politician can't do the job, but it's just going to be very interesting. I would suspect we'll see a challenge with regards to the ranked choice voting because it's new and there's always going to be a challenge. And I don't think we'll know who's going to be the mayor until the next mayoral election, probably.
Oh boy, Nyla, we have about a minute left. I'm going to give you the last word on our ongoing mayoral election. And also, does somebody, aside from the winner of the Republican primary, really have a shot at beginning not only their November campaign, but the transition, because there's a lot at stake.
Absolutely. I think to the second question, I think a Republican could potentially have a chance, although they are have to do a lot of electoral building in terms of more registration. Because I think with Eric Adams at the top, it shows that there's a strong appetite for a moderate centrist candidate. And I think that it also reflects, the left-wing progressive side of the Democratic Party needs to do a lot better job at coalition building. And I think lastly, I think just regarding the ranked choice voting, I think it's hard to really have any insight regarding, who could be number 2 or who could be number 3, because ranked choice voting erases this complicated electoral calculus for candidates across the ideological spectrum, and ballots are going to be mixed with both progressive and moderates. And lastly, I think regarding a potential challenge to ranked choice voting, some early exit polling for good government groups proved that only 42% of New York voters actually used all 5 slots, and that a majority of those voters were white voters, right? And so I think this perpetuates the same system of white voters being disproportionately represented in our electoral process, which ranked choice voting claimed to want to eliminate in terms of better representation. So I think ultimately in the end, Eric Adams may very well be our next mayor, but with not knowing who picked number 2s, again, because people pick candidates based on ideology, policy positions, personality. We have no real way of understanding the voter intention, and how oftentimes that can be lost in these conversations when it comes to thinking about what are the issues that are most important to New Yorkers for the next mayoral administration.
All right, well, we are going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time, but I'd like to thank my entire panel, JC Polanco, Kirk Burkhalter, and Nayela Amaru. Thank you all so much for sharing your insight on these critically important issues that we'll be following as they develop and unfold. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
MetroFocus is made possible by Sue and Edgar Wackenheim III, Sylvia A. and Simon B. Poita Programming Endowment to Fight Anti-Semitism, the Peter G. Peterson and Joan Gans Cooney Fund, Bernard and Denise Schwartz, Barbara Hope Zuckerberg, the Ambrose Monell Foundation, and by Janet Prindle Seidler, Jody and John Arnhold, Cheryl and Philip Milstein family, Judy and Josh Weston, Dr. Robert C. and Tina Sohn Foundation, the JPB Foundation,